Okay, we ready to go? Hillary?
Chair Kelly, could we have 30 more seconds? We're just going to let a few more folks in before we begin.
Okay, we ready to go?
You bet.
Hillary? Yeah, just let me know as soon as we're all.
Good morning, everyone. This is the board administrator for in Salem headquarters. We are ready to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to the Wednesday, August 24th Board of Forestry virtual special meeting. For the record, I'm Jim Kelly, Chair of the State Board of Forestry. Today, we are live streaming this event on YouTube, and all participants are joining this meeting virtually. To ensure our viewers online can follow along with our proceedings, I'll go over some meeting housekeeping items. Everyone participating, please silence your cell phones and try to limit any background noises. Remember to mute yourself when you are not speaking and disable your video when not presenting or part of the discussion. For the record, we ask all board members, department staff, and guests to state their names for those listening online. If you experience online technical issues, use the chat function on Zoom to connect with our ODF host during this meeting. For those who would like to offer comments on the matters discussed today, please send in your comments by August 26th. They will be entered into the record and become part of our board's meeting minutes. We scheduled this special meeting to give the board and public an opportunity to learn about the private Forest Accord rulemaking effort. As many may know, the Oregon legislature directed the board and the department through Senate Bills 1501 and 1502 to develop rules to implement the agreements made through the private Forest Accord discussions. Our meeting today will be utilized for two purposes: to ensure that we're able to meet the legislative deadlines for the private Forest Accord, and two, to comply with the Department of Administrative Services deadline for agency request biennial budget submissions. Before I conduct a roll call, I wanted to take a moment to recognize how quickly Oregon's state of fire on the landscape can change, and maintaining safety should remain a top priority as the season's activities are ramping up and as we have tragically seen. So Cal, can you offer us a few comments?
Thank you, Chair Kelly. For the record, my name is Cal Mukamoto, and I serve as Oregon State Forester. And I'm saddened to share the news, but I want to take a moment and acknowledge the loss of two wildland firefighters in Oregon within the last couple of weeks. Colin Hagan from Colorado Hotshot Crew and Logan Taylor from a contracted crew here in Oregon both fell in the line of duty. Our hearts are with the families and friends while they mourn. These losses are very difficult on our staff and the entire wildland fire community. We continue to focus on safety and hope all remaining staff return home safely. Chair Kelly.
Thank you, Cal. In honor of Logan Taylor and Colin Hagan, I would like to call for a moment of silence. Board members, please unmute yourself as I perform roll call to confirm board attendance and quorum for today's decision items. When I call on you, please state your attendance as present by video. Liz Akpoa,
Chair Kelly, I am here.
Carla Chambers,
Here.
Ben Doimling,
Here, present by video.
Shonda Ferrari,
Present by video.
Joe Justice,
I'm here by video.
Brenda McComb,
Present by video.
and obviously myself, Jim Kelly, is also present by video. Okay, let's begin with item one. Nick, are you ready to begin?
Morning, Chair Kelly, members of the board, State Forester Mukomoto. Yes, I'm ready to begin. And I'm Nick Henneman, Forest Resources Division Deputy Chief for the Forest Practices and Monitoring half of the division. Division Chief Josh Barnard will not be able to present this morning or on the next topic. He may be available if needed during the discussion that follows these presentations. For the purposes of this agenda item is to provide the board with an overview of the recent progress on the Forest Practices Act administrative rule drafting and close consultation with the Private Forest Accord report authors. The authors of the Private Forest Accord report will offer their perspectives on the rule drafting process. Now I will turn it over to Bob Van Dyke, Chris Edwards, and Ken Nygren, and they will present in this order. So go ahead, Bob.
Thank you, Nick. Chair Kelly, board members, Forester Mukomoto, for the record, Bob Van Dyke. I live in Forest Grove, Oregon, and I work for the Wild Salmon Center. I participated in the Forest Accord process as part of the fishing and conservation community. I'm very pleased you have the opportunity to move the new PFA rules into the formal rulemaking process today, and I strongly encourage you to take that step. Our team's doing a final review of the rules. We may have some minor things to flag in the comment period, but I'm sure they'll be resolvable. We work closely with both ODF and ODF&W, as well as the other private accord signatories, to try to capture the intent of the PFA legislation and the intent of the private forest accord signatories, and I'm confident we did that. These are obviously a pretty dramatic revision to the Forest Practice Act, and they're the product of work a lot of people, but I particularly today want to thank the many ODF and ODF&W staff who helped with the rule drafting process. It took a lot of patience, and their expertise was very much appreciated in the process. Just a couple other things to say today. One is that earlier this year, I came before you and I flagged a few key topics on the HCP, on the PFA long-term topics. And I want to note those again. One is keeping the HCP on track for 2027. If we don't get that HCP, these rules roll back to the current rules. So that's super important, I think, to all the parties to get that done. Secondly, the Forest Accord establishes a closer relationship between ODF and ODF&W. And so I think that requires some thought and some tending. I understand there have been discussions about developing some kind of memorandum of agreement between ODF&W to improve communication in light of the PFA. So I call your attention to that as well. And then lastly, I think the small forest landowner program really needs attention. It's a new program. There's a really important set of landowners there from whom we need buy-in and support and understanding. So I call particular attention to that to you. I haven't discussed this as much. Some of you may know that that there were some things we couldn't agree on in the Forest Accord, but we decided to keep working on in the near term. So I want to note those for you because they're going to be coming before you soon. One is that there be rulemaking completed on tethered logging. So a lot of tethered logging that happens now. Our team wanted to have a close look at that, at those rules. I'm hopeful that that won't be too hard. A second topic, though, that may be more controversial is the rules for post-disturbance logging or salvage logging after fires. So we couldn't come to agreement on that topic. The PFA anticipates the conversations will continue on that. I think 2025, by 2025, we hope to have new rules developed, or at least a revisiting of the rules, a reconsideration of the rules. And that part of that also will be the question of desired future conditions for riparian areas. So we've got kind of we did come to a short-term agreement or agreed not to agree on some things in the current rule package, but some of those rules expire. So that post-disturbance logging is an important one. A third and lastly is that the PFA also considers some refinements in the approach to small forest landowners. A couple topics there. One is excessive encumbrances. That is, if there are some landowners who really have an extraordinary burden that come from the new PFA rules, we think there needs to be some kind of accommodation or consideration of accommodation there. Maybe an extension of the tax credits, for example, that exist in other parts of the PFA for small woodland owners. But that would take legislation to do. Anyway, there's some more work to do there, I think, on that excessive encumbrance issue. So in closing, a couple quick thoughts. One is I want to say that this rule package really does address many of the concerns that the fishing and conservation community have brought before you for years. And we appreciate the spirit of compromise that the timber industry brought here. And we hope we can have a collaborative process going forward to consider those rules, their effectiveness, and the need for revision. But I also want to convey, the larger community I work with, the 13 signatories, also note that there are continuing concerns they've got, other issues, and I don't think these will be a surprise for you, but I did want to note them. One is pesticide use continues to be an issue of interest in the conservation community. Another is drinking water, management of drinking water source areas. I think the intersection between pesticide and management of drinking water source areas. Certainly, and this is a familiar topic to this board, is management for carbon sequestration. And then lastly is terrestrial species. This is obviously aquatic HCP, revisiting of the terrestrial species approaches. Now, I don't mean to make any claims about what policy would be best or how to approach those. I just want to note that those are continuing topics of discussion. Shouldn't be a surprise to you. I'm sure they'll continue before this board and in other places. So thanks for the chance to address you today, and I'm happy to take comments or questions. I do think Chris Edwards is next.
All right. Good morning.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jim, I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
Bob, this is board member Carla Chambers, and I have a two-part question. This whole effort is really about assurance and certainty. And I wondered if you would address that and just, give us your view of the assurances and certainty that came to the table. And the second is, I know you have been a long time interest in the financial health of the Oregon Department of Forestry, and we've had numerous talks on that subject. Did you do any economic analysis on the economic impact of the private forest accord, not only to rural counties, but also to the Department of Forestry?
Thanks, board member Chambers, for those questions. On the question of assurance and certainty, well, I think before the Forest Accord agreement came into effect, you may know that there were 9 ballot measures that have been put forward. And certainly that I would say, created a lot of uncertainty for all the parties. I can say, I think confidently that some of the forest industry folks didn't like the ballot measures that the conservation community put forward, and vice versa. We didn't like the ones that industry had put forward. So I think in some ways, stability and certainty comes from parties agreeing to forge a path together, because that releases and diminishes a lot of pressure that there might be to take another approach. Obviously, quite practically on the assurance side, if the state's successful in getting the HCP, that will give some assurances to landowners in terms of having take permit coverage and some insulation from Federal Endangered Species Act litigation for the aquatic species and the amphibians that are covered under it. So I think there are assurances there as well. Big picture, I think the political dynamic or the policy dynamic has changed somewhat in terms of, in many ways, we're working together with industry. And it's not always comfortable for everyone, but I think it's a lot better than where we were before. So I think some assurance and certainty comes from that. On the ODF health, the economic analysis issues that you raised, Carla, I think we did a pretty good job in terms of ODF health. I think that, we added 52 positions to the department. We made a strong case for funding. So my impression is that ODF is in a good place through the mix of general fund and harvest taxes that it receives in terms of administering the Forest Practice Act. In terms of the economic impact of this, I guess the short answer is no. We did not take this and say, what is the specific economic impact? But I think I can say confidently, and maybe Mr. Edwards can speak to this as well, the economic interests in the state, I would say, were well represented at the table. So, there were the timber companies obviously were there, and one of their primary interests was their bottom line and how this would affect their bottom line. So yeah, there is not a separate analysis that has been done, but I'm confident that those voices were clearly part of the conversation. It's not as if they were excluded. The last piece regarding rural counties, I doubt that there's a very significant effect on rural counties. I'd be happy to have that discussion further with you about that, but I think the effects are probably fairly marginal in terms of employment, certainly revenue. Local counties don't really get much money from private forest land harvest. So there might be some marginal effects in terms of competition for logs, et cetera, but I wouldn't expect them to be particularly significant. Thanks.
Jim, this is Brenda McComb. I have a question, please.
Go ahead, Brenda. Thank you.
Bob, thanks for the presentation. I appreciate that. You mentioned a number of things that are still outstanding that need agreement, and you're going to continue to work on that. And that's great. That's wonderful. I'm glad to hear that. But as a point of clarification for me, will this approach to forest policy on private lands then continue in your mind in terms of the two really large stakeholders coming together to find agreement and then bringing that proposal to the board? Is that the future of forest policy on private lands in the future?
Board member McComb, I hope not. I don't think so. I think I think more likely is, I think these are going to be state-run processes. These are, the department is tagged with running these processes. These processes are not to be run by the stakeholders. I do anticipate that under Forester Mukamoto, that his team will put a process together, and obviously I think they'll want to be in touch and discuss this with the parties, whoever's interested in. But I'm imagining it will be certainly open to be a broader conversation. I guess I'd also like to say, and I neglected to say this to Ms. Chambers before, and that's where I think some and I will tie these pieces together. I think some certainty comes from the process with the new adaptive management process we put together. So and what that gives is certainty that the rules are not likely to change quickly or without a strong scientific basis for making them. So the new system we put together with the Adaptive Management Committee lays out pretty specific criteria and methods for bringing issues forward, for considering them thoroughly, and then for presenting to the board potential choices to make. And so, so anyway, I think there'll be some stability that comes from that new adaptive management process. And the reason I mention that is because I think there'll be room for that new stakeholder-driven adaptive management process to weigh in on some of these same issues. For example, the Adaptive Management Committee and the science team associated may be able to play a role in the post-disturbance rulemaking. So there's a new process that is put together that I hope does not look like this one in the past, which was sort of the parties trying to figure it out to bring something forward. I hope it's a much more, and I anticipate it will be a much more traditional kind of department-driven with board oversight and stakeholder involvement in those issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob.
Jim, this is Joe Justice. Hey, sorry, Bob, you're first speaker, so you're getting all the questions here. I was curious about, you mentioned adaptive management, and one thing that was really, I was very pleased with the outcome of the private forest accord was the ability to manage and riparian areas in Eastern Oregon to, make them more resilient to fire, move forward with desired future conditions in a lot of places that need that work. And we were, we worked towards, I think, a really great outcome in Eastern Oregon. Was there conversations regarding that in Western Oregon? I know we have some very, some buffers with kind of, large no-cut buffers that, had that conversation come up? I mean, my hope is the adaptive management process will begin to have that conversation. I mean, I'm a forester, Bob, and I know there's some abilities to potentially have some good outcomes through management in riparian areas. I'm just curious your perspective on that.
Yeah, my perspective is definitely, we discussed it. And I think our intention is that this no-cut approach is sort of the de facto approach, but that through a plan for alternate practice in particular that can actually, those exist already. They basically allow landowners to undertake practices that may not follow the letter of the law, but that achieve the intent of the law. So, for example, improving aquatic health. And I think the classic example that's probably familiar to a lot of folks in riparian areas is a place that's really dense plantation that was replanted when there was no required stream buffer. So there was cut down to the stream edge, and then a dense plantation was put in. And there are good questions about what kind of treatments are going to lead to the best long-term aquatic health there. So I think that question will be tied up some board member justice with the desired future condition conversation that's dead ahead. I think because of the great interest in both enabling management of those areas, but also having sideboards on that management that ensure it's attaining the aquatic goals for the area, that there's more conversation to be had there. And I do think that's an area potentially for the Adaptive Management Committee or the independent science team that's been created to offer some thoughts as well.
Yeah, and Bob, I really appreciate you mentioning the plan for alternate practice. I think it is a tool by which landowners, often, are hesitant or trying to understand how they may engage the department with that. And I guess I would really encourage the department and landowners to explore those options when we have possibilities to actually improve riparian health through management. And so, I'm really happy you bring that up. I know you're very aware of that that process within the existing Forest Practices Act, Plan for Alternate Practice. And I'd really encourage the department to explore that because you're exactly right, Bob. There are many places exactly as you described that have been, dense plantations have been planted down to the stream edge, that there are, when you begin to look at what are we really trying to accomplish with desired future conditions, some level of management, some entry, some is I think very appropriate and for the long-term health of these riparian areas. So thank you. I really appreciate you mentioning that.
Yeah, I would just like to add one more thing, if I may, and that is we've also discussed, and there's clear language in the Forest Accord report about the things that are even more dramatic. That is, for example, in some cases, there are places that were historically hardwood dominated, where there was a fire regime that excluded conifers, that have then become dominated by conifers, and that has had undesirable effects. I know the Nature Conservancy has done some work where they removed conifers entirely and reestablished hardwoods as a dominant species, and the water table came up and the beavers came back, and they're all sort of desirable outcomes. So it's also a way of we also recognize that there may be cases where you really need to do something very different from the conifer-based historical approach that was taken in the Forest Practice Act. But again, those would need more individualized plans that explain why for a site-specific location that was better. Thanks for your patience weighing in on that, allowing me to weigh in on that.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Bob. I appreciate those comments. Thanks.
Okay, I appreciate it. We'll need to move along. I also think like in our next meeting, we're going to be talking about the effects of when we lose our ash trees, which is going to be a perfect example of where we may need to be doing some things in some of these riparian areas to deal with that. But let's go and move on with Chris.
Good morning, Chair Kelly and members of the board. Thank you for the opportunity to testify in support of the Private Forest Accord draft rules. For the record, my name is Chris Edwards, and I am president of the Oregon Forest Industries Council, which represents more than 50 large private forest landowners and wood products manufacturers in Oregon. While this is not the first opportunity for discussion about the Private Forest Accord in front of this board, this is the first opportunity OFIC as a trade association has had to testify in front of you about the Private Forest Accord. You're probably wondering why I'm in front of you instead of our Director of Forest Policy, Seth Barnes. Seth is the one who has put in hundreds of hours over the last few months organizing a robust engagement from our members, including those who were and were not signatories to the agreement, to help provide feedback to the department to shape the language of the draft rules in front of you today. He's the one who knows the painstaking detail and effort our members, ODF staff, and our ENGO partners put into reviewing every single word in the 141 pages before you. And it truly was a monumental effort. The reason I'm in front of you today, instead of Seth, is to underscore what this agreement means to our industry. At its core, the Private Forest Accord is about protecting a future for forestry in Oregon. It's about continuing to provide tens of thousands of family wage jobs for rural Oregonians, maintaining Oregon's proud position as the national leader in carbon-friendly building materials, and it's about turning the page on the timber wars of the past. I can say with assurance that these rules accurately reflect not only the agreement as it was written, but also the spirit in which it came to be. While not all OFIC members are signatories to the Private Forest Accord final agreement, all of our members were invited and encouraged to participate in providing feedback on the draft rules, including those who may have been skeptical or even opposed to the agreement when it was signed. Those who participated in the review process reflect our membership's diversity. Some are Oregon-based, family-owned companies, some are REITs or TIMOs, some are both manufacturers and forest landowners, and some are just forest landowners. And it is because of that diverse engagement I feel comfortable testifying before you today in support of these draft rules. A lot of hard work went into this effort, and not just from our members. ODF staff made every effort to consult all parties, including our ENGO partners, to make sure everyone felt satisfied with the final product, and we do. That is a testament to the collaborative relationships built over time through the Private Forest Accord. Having said that, these new rules will be and have already been extremely costly for our sector, and not just financially, although it comes with a very hefty price tag at a time when timber supply is increasingly jeopardized by wildfire. More than that, it has tested the unity and fortitude of our family. And I would disagree a little bit with my friend Bob Van Dyke. about his characterization of the impacts to rural communities perhaps being only marginal. If you decrease the amount of harvest that is happening on the landscape, you decrease all the jobs that are associated with the harvest and the reforestation and the manufacturing. And those jobs pay significantly more than the average wage in most of those rural counties where they're prevalent. So you may hear today and over the next month from those in the industry who are opposed to the agreement. You also hear from those who support it. Their concerns and opinions are all valid. But in the end, this is the best path forward for securing the future of our sector, and OFIC members recognize that. That being said, there is no more room for giving more. The original agreement was made in earnest consultation with professional foresters, and our members have continued to provide their expertise and practical experience to help shape these draft rules. There's no room for fine tuning, and I would humbly encourage you to support the collaborative nature in which these rules were created by adopting the rules as written. We still need your help though. Senate Bill 1501 dictated a very aggressive timeline for this rulemaking effort, and some elements remain outstanding, including chapters of technical guidance, rulemaking processes for both tethered logging and post-disturbance harvesting, and several trainings to develop and deliver. If there's one thing we learned in the rule drafting process, it's that in order to guarantee a thorough and complete job, the workload should be metered out at a measured pace and not rushed. We could use the board's help and guidance, making sure that happens and that all unresolved elements are resolved in the same collaborative spirit that has been cultivated. This agreement is a rare and genuine compromise. Not everyone got what they wanted, but everyone got something. We gave up a whole heck of a lot, but we believe the sacrifice is worth it to get some certainty and stability for our future. And that's progress worth supporting. That's why the OFIC Board of Directors voted to support passage of the PFA legislation, and why I'm here today representing them and asking you to do the same by adopting these draft rules as written. Thank you for your thoughtful consideration.
Next, if Mr. Nygren would want to step in.
I guess there's no questions for Chris. So I would start with good morning, State Forester Mukomoto, Chairman Kelly, and the members of the Board of Forestry. I am Ken Nygren, and I'm the current president of the Oregon Small Woodlands Association. And today I'm speaking on behalf of the association. Oswald was invited to participate in the private Forest Accord process early on as an author through our representative, Jim James. We feel our voice was heard through the process, with the evidence being the significant resources, new structures, and rule adjustments afforded to small landowners in the rules being presented today. We also hope that the board will recognize that these rules represent sacrifices that our member landowners will be making to contribute to a better private forest management for us and for our communities in the future. Sustaining these small forest landowner policies and funding commitments is important to achieving the success of the Habitat Conservation Plan and promote retaining forests as forest lands. In these rules presented today are some new concepts for forest management policy in Oregon, and especially for small forest landowners. The Division 607 rules outline these concepts and commitments made by the legislature to support the agreements of the Private Forest Accord. Some of these concepts are easy to recognize, large structural and funding changes, but also smaller but equally important accommodations built into the rules will help facilitate effective implementation of practices for family landowners which will achieve the goals of the Habitat Conservation Plan. The new Office of Forest Landowner Assistance, with its newly created funding program called the Small Forest Land Investment in Stream Habitat, or SFISH, is a much needed recognition that raising the standards for conducting forest management activities requires resources and technical knowledge that is often beyond the scope of most family forest landowners. The Forest Conservation Tax Credit is another new policy initiative that recognizes the significant loss of investment potential and cost to small landowners that implementing these rules will impose. The unique alternative practices recognized in this set of rules for small landowners are equally important to ensure success implementing these rules. Recognizing that some of these rules fall disproportionately greater on some landowners, and providing the department the ability to work with these landowners to mitigate impacts to them through alternative practices where their lands provide a significant portion of their income will continue within these rules, and the OSWA will remain committed and involved. The Private Forest Accord represents the combined efforts over 2 years of facilitated negotiation by groups of people who hold a common view that issues of disagreement can be resolved by those willing to sit together and talk to each other and not past each other. That overriding desire of all those involved in this process is to break the environment of acrimonious and emotion-driven policy and rulemaking with an eye towards long-term forest management, employing the best of consensus science to drive decision-making, keep forests as forests and families connected to their lands. Landowners today are asking the Board of Forestry to fully commit to supporting these new rules so that a flexible environment of regulatory and policy certainty can allow all the benefits of the forest that forests provide to be realized for families across Oregon. Finally, OSWA supports the success of the habitat conservation through its sacrifices caused by these rules, not because we enjoy the rules imposed, but to ensure its success so that we can hope to see our children posting their pictures and stories on social media of catching the big one, or our grandkids marveling at the frogs and salamanders they find. Thank you.
Nick, do we have any other presenters?
No, Jim, that's Mr. Chair Kelly, that's the end of this item.
Great, thank you. So I want to thank our guest speakers who are able to join us today and welcome them to stick around as we proceed with this item number 2. And also just want to say on behalf of the board, there is no group of people more appreciative of the work of the authors and all others involved in this. And we just can't say thank you enough, and particularly to the landowners, both large and small. I think we're all recognize the sacrifices and the cost of all of this, and that I think on behalf of the board and Oregonians, we just want to emphasize our appreciation. I would ask the rest of the board right now to hold any comments or questions so we can remain on schedule. You will have opportunity as we move forward with the Private Forest Accord Rulemaking Discussion. And I want to note that this is a decision item, and with that, we'll move back to the presentation. And so, Nick, we'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Chair Kelly, members of the board, State Forester Mukomoto. As we move to item 2 in the agenda, again, I'm Nick Henneman, Forest Resources Division Deputy Chief for Forest Practices and Monitoring. Purpose of this agenda item is to seek Board of Forestry approval to open public comment and direct the department to hold a hearing as directed in Senate Bills 1501 and 1502 to develop and revise the Forest Practices Act administrative rules to align with the Private Forest Accord report dated February 2nd, 2022, also known as the PFA report. The division's key staff members and I are here to give you an overview of the recommended draft rules. As you heard during the previous item, we worked closely with the Private Forest Accord report authors in drafting the proposed rules and ensuring alignment with the intent of the Private Forest Accord report. First, a little background. In February 2020, conservation and forest industry groups offered to revise the Forest Practices Act and administrative rules through a memorandum of understanding to include mediated discussions known as the Private Forest Accord. In June 2020, the legislature adopted Senate Bill 1602, which increased helicopter spray buffers, directed rulemaking for salmon, steelhead, and bull trout streams in the Siskiyou region, and set communication laws for applying pesticides by helicopter. The bill set the Accord timeline and topics for making changes to the Forest Practices Act and rules from which the board could apply for a programmatic habitat conservation plan, often called an HCP. The Accord concluded in late 2021. In March 2022, the legislature adopted the Accord recommendations through Senate Bills 1501 and 1502 and House Bill 4055. Senate Bill 1501 modified existing Forest Practices Act statutes, directed rulemaking, and incorporated by reference the Private Forest Accord report. The PFA report further detailed the recommended changes to be made to the Forest Practices Act administrative rules. It's a brief overview of some of those amendments to the Oregon Forest Practices Act include under ORS 527-620, the definitions section adds, among other definitions, aquatic resource and significant violation. Under ORS 527-630, added language to reinforce that compliance, enforcement, training, and inspections are vital to forests of Oregon. Under ORS 527.610 to 527.770, the operative portions of the FPA added language that provides department access for inspections and verification of completion reporting. ORS 527.680 covers violations by an operator and adds the ability to require a financial assurance for those with a history of significant violations. Under ORS 527.685, it's the civil penalties considerations, and it allows for increased penalties. Under Oregon Revised Statute 527.714, which outlines the procedures and findings necessary for rule analysis, for rules related to aquatic resources, it requires consistent level of protection with the PFA report or the Habitat Conservation Plan if one has been approved. It allows for receiving a report from the Adaptive Management Program Committee and the Independent Research and Science Team as basis for rule change if they have reviewed the new or increased standards, and it has qualifiers for the type of economic impact analysis required. There was also other minor cleanup done across the Forest Practices Act through those bills. Today, staff will provide an overview of the draft rules for adaptive management, compliance monitoring, harvest on steep slopes, stream classification and riparian areas, roads, enforcement, and small forest land owner assistance office and tax credit. Staff will also provide the board an update on tribal outreach and inclusion and the development of the Habitat Conservation Plan. Each presenter will have several slides and 5 to 7 minutes to go over key changes. Given the interconnected nature of the rules, I ask you wait until the end of all presentations to ask questions if possible. And up first is Terry Free, who will present on the Adaptive Management Program rules. If you want to go ahead, Terry, thank you.
Yep, thanks, Nick. Good morning, Chair Kelly, board members, and State Forester Mukomoto. I'm Terry Free, and I serve as monitoring coordinator with ODF, here to converse with you about the draft Adaptive Management Program rules that form a new draft rule division, number 603 of the Forest Practices Act. An adaptive management program is essential to an approved habitat conservation plan, or HCP, which is an end goal of the entire private forest accord. The purpose of this adaptive management program is to apply the best available science to board decision-making, which includes addressing whether the rules are effective at meeting the biological goals and objectives and the validity of both the biological goals and objectives and the methods and models for designing forest practices rules. Additionally, the program purpose is to ensure effective change as needed to meet the biological goals and objectives. Could we have the next slide, please? Increase the predictability and stability of the process of changing regulations so landowners, regulators, and interested members of the public can understand and anticipate change and effectively meet the biological goals and objectives with less operationally expensive prescriptions when feasible. Fundamental to adaptive management programs are the biological goals and objectives. These goals broadly describe the desired future conditions of an HCP in succinct statements and directs work towards achieving the vision and purpose of that HCP. Each goal steps down to one or more objectives to define how to achieve these conditions in measurable terms. Next, I will mention the program participants before describing how they function within the larger program. One key participant is the statutorily defined Board Advisory Committee called the Adaptive Management Program Committee, or AMPC for short. The AMPC includes 10 voting members and 3 non-voting members. Another key participant is the statutorily defined Board Advisory Committee called the Independent Research and Science Team, or IRST for short. It must have an odd number of at least 5 members that include one each from a public institution, the timber industry, and a non-governmental organization that promotes conservation of freshwater aquatic habitat. Members will be subject matter experts with graduate degrees in natural resources disciplines such as forestry, fisheries, and ecology. The AMPC and the IRST will develop their team charters, and their members may receive grants to participate. Finally, both groups shall make substantial decisions by supermajority votes. Note that the IRST is supported by a public entity contracted through ODF, with the initial contract going to OSU's Institute for Natural Resources. Finally, ODF has a coordinator supporting the success of the program. To enhance program effectiveness and accountability, ODF will apply the adaptive management process to the entire program by contracting for performance audits every 6 years, and ODF will report to the board annually. This slide summarizes the group's participation in the adaptive management process. Note that built into this process, but not shown here, are timelines to ensure the process moves forward continuously, as well as defined points for participants to go on the record with decisions rather than potentially having a non-vote be the decision. This slide illustrates the long-term process. However, note that the rules specify a ramp-up period for the AMPC to develop an initial list of research topics, the IRST to develop their standards for determining what is considered best available science, and both groups to develop their respective team charters. In the first step of the process, the AMPC identifies an initial research question, including key contextual information such as objective of the research. The board may also direct the AMPC to develop a particular research question. In the second step, the IRST shall refine the AMPC research question and confirm with the AMPC that their intent is maintained. The IRST shall then develop a proposal for doing the research that includes a literature review and a project scope of work with deliverables, timeline, and estimated budget. In step 3, the AMPC prioritizes these IRST proposals into a research agenda and forwards the associated budget to the board for your vote. Next, note that the current plan is for the legislature to fund the program beginning with the next biennium. In step 4, the IRST develops an annual work plan to implement the board-approved research agenda. They will contract this work via competitive requests for proposals. Step 5 is the IRST sending final reports and summaries of these reports in lay terms to the board and AMC for the respective considerations. Finally, in step 6, the AMC assesses the reports from the IRST and sends a report of their own to the board for consideration. AMC may recommend no change, rule change, additional scientific inquiry, or other policy action such as rule guidance or training. Also, AMC minority reports may be included in the reports to the board. The board will then decide on the AMC recommendations. Thank you. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Rebecca McCown, who will speak about completion notifications and compliance monitoring.
Thank you, Terry. Good morning, Chair Kelly, board members, and State Forester Mukomoto. My name is Rebecca McCown, and I'm the Riparian Aquatic Specialist with the Monitoring Unit in the Forest Resource Division. I'll be going over 2 new rule sets: the Compliance Monitoring Program and the Notification of Completion of Operation, both authorized in statute under Senate Bill 1501, Section 2, 1A, 43, and 44. I will first cover the notification of completion of operation. The goal for this draft rule is to improve compliance monitoring program implementation by requiring landowners to report to the state forester of completed operations for which they have notified. The objective is to create process through an e-notification system or other methods for landowners to report on the completion of activities. This process will improve sample set available for compliance monitoring assessments. This rule is being added to Division 629-605, Planning Forest Operations, and will be added to the notification to state foresters when, where, and how section. Landowners will need to notify by the end of the calendar year of the notification. If the original notification is extended, report by the end of the calendar year of the continued notification. When landowners report, they will need to do so on each activity for which they have notified. I will now cover the compliance monitoring program. A new rule division has been created for the compliance monitoring program. This will replace ODF's existing compliance monitoring program. The new compliance monitoring program framework is outlined in draft rule. The purpose and goals are to assess rule compliance and report findings to the Board of Forestry, Legislature, and Federal Services, to identify areas needing improvement for training purposes. This effort will increase the public's trust in the implementation of the Forest Practices Act and rules. Monitoring may be conducted by the department through department staff, contractors, or both. The program will be supported by stakeholder group with expertise in rules being monitored. The group will not be limited to department staff, landowners, tribes, and public representatives. The Board of Forestry may also direct analysis. New to the rule, one of the new rules is that forest landowners will accommodate access, and the state forester may petition the circuit court with jurisdiction for warrant authorizing access. Landowners will be notified before assessment and will be provided the opportunity to be present, or have a representative present. The new draft rules will increase statistical rigor compared to past efforts. Improvement will be a result of having a statistician involved in the study design and analysis, and by having a notification of completion requirement and site access. Compliance monitoring program will prioritize the following draft rules: water protection rules, harvest rules, forest road and road construction and maintenance rules, and other rules as directed by the board. The compliance monitoring program shall provide any required reporting to the federal services in support of the Habitat Conservation Plan, annual report to the public on the overall Habitat Conservation Plan performance. In addition, a 2-year report summarizing the results and progress on efforts, and every 8 years, an aggregate cumulative report that includes the compliance trends. The program will also provide reports as directed by the board. Thank you. Now I will hand it over to my colleague, Keith Baldwin, who will speak about harvesting on steep slopes.
Good morning, Chair Jim Kelly, board members, and State Forester Cal Mukomoto. I'm Keith Baldwin. I'm the Forest Practices Field Coordinator and Policy Analyst I'll be providing a high-level review of the draft rules and for harvesting on steep slopes. The Private Forest Accord report describes the goals for harvesting on steep slopes are to provide high-quality habitat that supports recovery, protection, and long-term conservation of covered species on private forest lands. The goal is accomplished by 3 objectives that focus on leaving trees in designated or identified areas on steep slopes. The leave trees in designated areas determined by the slopes model will deliver materials for fish stream habitat and provide non-fish stream habitat for covered species. The leave trees in field identified areas will reduce timber harvest related mass wasting events to fish streams and will contribute large wood to fish streams. And the leave trees in field identified areas of unstable slopes next to fish streams will provide slope stability and large wood for habitat. The draft rules include 17 new definitions, and the harvesting on steep slope rules are located in the Division 630 harvesting rules. New rules were added to address the steep slope areas in the small forest landowner minimum option. Land managed under the small forest landowner minimum option have alternate standards for the opportunity for the forest conservation tax credit. The draft rules modified some existing rules to align with the Private Forest Accord report. The following slides will briefly review the designated and identified steep slope areas. The designated debris flow traversal areas apply in Western Oregon. These areas are identified by the slopes model and displayed in the e-notification system, also known as FERNS. The slopes model is a probability model being developed to be completed by mid-May next year. The state forester will assist small forest owners to determine the designated debris flow traversal areas. When there are stream classification changes, the slope model will not immediately change. The slopes model identifies areas most likely to deliver debris flow to fish streams. Leave trees are required along the type N streams and the length of the designated debris flow traversal areas. The designated sediment source areas apply in Western Oregon. These areas are identified by the slopes model and displayed in the e-notification system. When there are stream classification changes, the slope model will not immediately change. Forest land that is managed under the small forest landowner minimum option is not required to follow the rules for designated sediment source areas. The slopes model identifies areas most likely to experience landslides that initiate debris flow that will likely deliver to fish streams. The slopes model also identifies areas with trigger sources that are most likely to trigger a high volume debris flow. Areas with trigger sources are prioritized over areas without trigger sources. The slope retention areas apply in Western Oregon. The slope retention areas represent a minimum of 50% of the designated sediment source areas. Slope retention areas are field identified and prioritized areas. Forest land that is managed under the small forest landowner minimum option is not required to follow the rules for slope retention areas. Leave trees are required in the field identified slope retention areas, again, which are a subset of the designated sediment source areas. Stream adjacent failures apply statewide. Stream adjacent failures are located on slopes greater than 70%. They are field identified areas next to fish streams and are actively failing or unstable slopes. Leave trees are required upslope of the riparian management areas of fish streams that have stream adjacent failures. For industrial landowners, the riparian management area width is extended by the lesser of 170 feet from the fish stream or to the slope break greater than 20%. For small forest landowners, the riparian management area width will be extended by the lesser of 30 feet beyond the fish stream RMA or to the slope rate of greater than 20%. There are two common elements for each of the designated and identified areas on steep slopes. Both require a written plan, and wildlife lead trees may count in these areas. The next steps to support the rules for harvesting on steep slopes are to create forest practices technical guidance to identify slope retention areas and to create certified training to field identify the slope retention areas. Now I'll speak to you about stream classification and vegetation retention. This will be a high level review of the draft rules for water protection rules, specifically for stream classification and vegetation retention. Revision to the water protection rules is one of the keystone pieces of the private forest accord agreements. The objectives of the new rules are to develop a stream network for fish stream and stream perenniality, ensure a balance of ecological and economic needs for landowners while recognizing the important benefits and functions of riparian areas. The rules for streamside vegetation retention requirements are based on the stream average flow or stream size and the designated beneficial use. The objective is to simplify the geographic regions as Eastern and Western Oregon. Also to provide options for small forest landowners to use alternate vegetation retention standards. Draft rule revisions in Division 635 address stream classification and water quality goals. The draft rules proposed repealing Division 642 and replacing it with a new Division 643. Division 643 draft rules retain or revise Division 642 language concerning the following: goals and visions of the desired future condition of the streamside forest stands. The ability to count a portion of the remaining trees in the riparian management areas as part of the wildlife leaf tree retention requirements. There are additional restrictions for harvesting equipment working near streams. And to retain alternative prescriptions for catastrophic fires, hardwood conversions, and site-specific plans for alternate practice. In Division 635, the rules revise the stream classification for fish use by using a fish distribution model and information from existing field surveys. The contractor is developing a high-resolution LiDAR-based stream network that incorporates the fish model and perennial status of stream classification. Rules simplify the geographic regions to Eastern and Western Oregon. Rules required increased coordination with Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife regarding the perennial stream model, protocols for field identification of the end of stream perenniality, and field survey for fish use. In Division 643, the major changes we made deal with streamside vegetation retention and associated protection. In consultation with the Accord authors, a revised desired future condition goals were developed to reflect the new riparian management area protections. Rules added equipment limitation zones to protect soil function and habitat for species near stream areas during harvest activities with cable or ground equipment. Based on stream perennial flow, a combination of tree retention and the equipment limitation zone apply to small streams. Rules retained alternate prescriptions for catastrophic fires, hardwood conversion, and the site-specific plan for an alternate practice. Rules developed standard practices for large landowners and is available to small forest landowners. The Western Oregon standard practices mostly provide a no-touch tree retention areas that range from 75 to 110 feet on fish streams and for large and medium-sized non-fish streams. For small fish streams with perennial flow, there are different tree retention requirements for portions of streams where perennial flow flows into type SSBT or type F streams. For small non-fish streams with seasonal flow, there is no tree retention requirements. The equipment limitation zone is a 35-foot area beginning at the edge of the stream and extending out for all streams. The Eastern Oregon standard practice includes two distinct riparian management areas or zones described as the inner and outer zone. The inner zone is the area immediately near the stream channel and extending 30 feet out. And the outer zone extends from the outside edge of the inner zone and extends to variable widths based on the stream size and classification. The inner zone requires tree retention within 30 feet of the stream. The outer zone may be managed by utilizing a partial harvest or thinning to provide benefits such as fire resiliency and the retention of key tree species to enhance forest health in the riparian areas. The equipment limitation zone is a 30-foot area beginning at the outside edge of the inner zone and extending out for all streams. The draft rules acknowledge the inherent differences between small forest landowners and large forest landowners while meeting the objectives of the accord agreements. The draft rules provide small forest landowners several options regarding riparian management areas. They may use the standard practice prescription, the minimum option prescription, or a combination of the standard practice and the ability to apply for the forest conservation tax credit. The minimum option is limited by a cap that is based on the total stream miles owned by small forest landowners inside that respective watershed. The minimum option prescription allows for the harvesting in the riparian management area, which is narrower than the standard practice riparian management area. The tables showing the riparian management areas for the small forest landowner option can be viewed in the draft rules. This concludes the high-level review of Division 635 and Division 643. Thank you, and I'll hand it off to my colleague Greg Erb to speak about road construction and inventory rules.
Good morning, Chair Kelly, board members, and State Forester Mukomoto. My name is Greg Erb, and I serve as the Forest Resources Road Specialist. I'm going to briefly highlight the changes to the draft rules for road construction and maintenance. The changes in the draft rules have two key areas of focus: minimizing opportunities for sediment to enter waters of the state and ensuring unimpeded fish passage. The draft rules emphasize minimizing hydrologic connectivity throughout the road network. A common example of hydrologic connectivity is a road ditch line that runs directly into a stream crossing. Additional rules detailing stream crossing design, construction, and written plans are a significant element of the proposed rules. Draft rules establish a process to identify and improve stream crossings to ensure unimpeded fish passage within a 20-year timeframe, and establishes stream simulation as the required fish stream crossing strategy when feasible. Additionally, the requirement to design all stream crossings to convey the 50-year peak flow has been increased to the 100-year peak flow. The proposed rules add specificity to current rules, which require avoiding locating roads in sensitive areas, as well as requiring written plans when locating roads in these areas. Critical locations include very steep slopes, locations near streams, and within wetlands. The Forest Road Inventory and Assessment, known as FRIA, is a 20-year process in which landowners identify and correct road-related issues. The first 5 years are the inventory phase, in which a comprehensive road network inventory must be completed. Years 5 through 20 are the implementation phase, in which landowners must complete the necessary improvements. The draft rules included an inventory of abandoned roads, From that inventory, abandoned roads with a high level of risk to waters of the state are prioritized and incorporated into the FRIA process to be vacated. All of the draft rules apply to small forest land owners, with the exception of the FRIA process. Small forest landowners will be required to submit a road condition assessment when notifying for any timber harvest operations. Some improvements identified by the road condition assessment may qualify for funding to repair, fish stream crossings, for example. Thank you. Now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Nick Hale, who will speak about enforcement.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Kelly, members of the board, and State Forester Mukomoto. My name is Nick Hale. I'm a stewardship forester serving the Western Lane District in Bonita. This morning, we'll first review Division 670 on enforcement and civil penalties and wrap up with Division 672 on enforcement, on forest practice administration. Updates within Division 670 include rules for pesticide applications by helicopter statutes to incorporate them into the civil penalty process for contesting within the FPA process. Additionally, ORS 527-680 and 527-685 have brought changes as well. Updates with our standard civil penalty calculations have resulted in the maximum amount being doubled, which prompted the base fines to be doubled as well. Under the civil penalty administrator discretion, the administrator would be able to consider the history of a company that changed its name to avoid higher civil penalties because of previous violations. A new concept under the Private Forest Accord, significant violators are those individuals or companies that have failed to file a notification of operation, are in non-compliance with an order of the state forester, or a violation that will take an estimated 10 years or more to restore. Another new concept under the PFA is repeat violators. They are considered an operator that has a history of significant violations that shows a pattern of willful disregard for the Forest Practices Act rules or orders. State Forester will maintain a list of individuals and entities with 3 or more significant violations within 3 years. A repeat violator will be removed from the list 3 years after their last citation was issued. Utilization of the significant violation civil penalties for repeat violators must have 3 or more significant violations in 3 years, which makes them a repeat violator. Then, civil penalty administrator will consider the organizational structure of the party incurring the penalty and if they derived economic benefits from the activity. Significant violation factors are incorporated into the formula with the addition of a new factor which relates to the average number of notifications they have per year. This allows for the reduction of those individuals or entities that have a significant number of notifications with a small number of significant violations. The base penalty is set at $2,000 for significant violations. The maximum penalty is $50,000 or the value determined by the formula, whichever is less. A financial assurance or bond is only required if an operator, landowner, or timber owner is considered a repeat violator. The violator must post and maintain a financial assurance instrument throughout the active periods of the operation, including stopping and restarting at a later date. The new rule set establishes assurance amounts based on either the type and number of protected resources or the number of acres within the operation. Maximum value of a bond or assurance instrument is $250,000. State forester may also make claims against the assurance instrument if the agency has to repair damage and or for the recovery of civil penalties. Should a violator fail to post the required financial assurance with the state forester, or if they stop the operation and fail to renew their bond when resuming activities, the state forester may issue an order to prohibit any new operations until they have filed an active financial assurance. Finally, there are only a few changes to Division 672 involving lists of what is considered an order of the state forester that can be contested. In addition to current orders, an operator, landowner, or timber owner will be able to contest the finding of being a repeat violator or that financial assurance is required of them. This would allow for the expedited hearing process and the Board of Forestry final order issued within 28 days after the request, which is a potential additional workload for the board. This completes the updates to the draft rules on enforcement and civil penalties. I'll now hand off to Nate Aglesoff for the small forest landowners section.
Hello and good morning. Chair Kelly, members of the board, State Forestry Mukomoto. My name is Nate Aglesoff, and I serve as the Interim Assistance Program Unit Manager. Today, I'll provide a brief overview of the small forest landowner portion of the Private Forest Accord Draft Rule Package. There's general goals for administration of the small forest landowner program, as well as specific tasks. At the foundation is the recognition that small forest landowners, or otherwise called SFOs, differ in several ways from industrial landowners in their needs, goals, and even where their properties may be located. Senate Bill 1501 provided the direction for the establishment of the Small Forest Landowner Assistance Office within the Department of Forestry. The Assistance Office provides the housing for support of the program and providing landowner assistance generally, as well as the management and implementation of incentive opportunities that are available to small forest land owners. The criteria for defining a small forest land owner are provided in statute. One of these qualifiers is that SFOs own less than 5,000 acres of forested land, along with some additional criteria based on past and projected harvest volumes. Qualifying as a small forest landowner will largely be a self-certification process where the landowner will attest to meet the criteria, and the department may request supporting documentation if and when there is a specific need to. Small forest landowner creates a new rule division, numbered 607. SFO specific provisions intersect with several topics in other rule divisions. The cleanest approach from a structure and organization standpoint was to provide the associated and applicable rule references in this location and provide some finer detail on the SFO specific requirements, the core functions of the SFO Assistance Office, and the programs available to SFOs. Now I'll introduce the two new incentive programs to be administered by the Small Forest Landowner Assistance Office. The first is the Small Forest Land Investment in Stream Habitat, or SFISH program. SFISH is a program that provides the financial means for road improvement projects for the greatest resource benefit. Examples of these projects for road improvement would include culvert replacements, improving fish passage, and the repair, relocating, or vacating of forest roads. The funding for this program is being requested through Policy Option Package number 106, Private Forest Accord Development. The SFISH program is to be a coordinated effort between agencies throughout the process, from identifying high-value conservation locations to funding priorities and project ranking. Small forest landowners will be receiving state funds to complete their projects through the SFISH program, and so the eligibility criteria will be verified by supporting documentation to be provided by the applicant. SFOs will also need to complete a road condition assessment. And while these road condition assessments may be required for harvest operations, SFOs will also be able to complete and submit one at any time to the Small Forest Landowner Assistance Office. The second program to be managed by the SFO Assistance Office is the Forest Conservation Credit. This is a tax credit for the stumpage value of the forest conservation area. Riparian management areas and their widths will vary by the stream classification. The eligible area for this value calculation is the difference between the standard practice RMA distance and the SFO minimum option distance. The applicable length is the distance adjacent to the harvest area. The forest conservation area is encumbered for a period of 50 years and is filed as a deed restriction at the county office by the small forest landowner. It is possible the forest conservation area can be removed. If removed, the original owner would need to repay the amount of credit used. And if the property were to change ownership, the new landowner would need to repay the original amount of the credit issued. There are multiple acceptable methods for determining the value of the credit outlined in the rule language. And by default, it is 100% of the stumpage value in the forest conservation area or 50% in those dry channel areas. If the fifth field watershed cap has been reached and the SFO minimum option is not available, the credit value becomes 125% of the stumpage value. The forest conservation credit is applied to the forest landowner's tax liability and can be applied year after year until it is depleted. To be eligible for the forest conservation credit, the landowner must certify that they meet the definition and criteria of an SFO, submit a notification of operations for a type 1, 2, or 3 harvest, follow the standard practice during their harvest operations, and submit stumpage value documentation to the Small Forest Landowner Assistance Office. And this concludes the small forest landowner portion of the presentation. So at this time, I will turn it over to Christine Buell, who will speak about tribal outreach and inclusion.
Thank you, Nate. Good morning, Chair Kelly, board members, and State Forester Mukomoto. I am Christine Buell, entomologist within the Forest Health Unit at the Oregon Department of Forestry. And today I'll be providing an overview on our engagement with the tribes on the Private Forest Accord Habitat Conservation Plan. Next slide, please. Thus far, we have reached out to the tribes and provided an overview of the Private Forest Accord and forthcoming Habitat Conservation Plan, which may not have been on the tribe's radar because historically the Forest Practices Act did not directly apply to tribal lands. We then invited tribes individually to opt into the Habitat Conservation Plan and to provide guidance on what this process would look like. Next slide. For background, we have 9 federally recognized tribes scattered across Oregon, many of which are confederations of multiple tribes. And many of these tribes maintain forest lands. The HCP would apply only to fee lands or other lands without a nexus with federal management or agreements. Next slide, please. Thus far, we have reached out to the Legislative Commission on Indian Services, both Natural Resource and the Cultural Resource Cluster Groups, a tribal forum previously created for engagement on the ODF State Forest HCP, as well as the tribal liaison for the governor's office. In these meetings, the tribes expressed a few major points. They expressed that there was a request that we engage early and often on this and other projects, strategies, and direction. And they expressed a desire for all of the agencies within the state to be communicating across disciplines wherever applicable. Lastly, they also requested a formal engagement between the state forester and a gathering of all of the federally recognized tribes at one time. This could actually be an opportunity for engagement on other efforts such as the 20-year strategic plan. And with that, I thank you for your time and I will hand off to Jennifer Weichel, who will review the HCP.
Thank you, Christine. Good morning, Chair Kelly, board members, and State Forester Mukomoto. I'm Jennifer Weichel. I'm the wildlife biologist for the Forest Resources Division, and I'm also serving as the coordinator for the Private Forest Accord Habitat Conservation Plan. Next slide. So throughout my presentation, I'll be using the acronym HCP to refer to the Private Forest Accord Habitat Conservation Plan. The ultimate purpose of the HCP and why this exists is to obtain an incidental take permit for the covered aquatic species described in the Private Forest Accord report. And the purpose of this is to obtain the regulatory assurances under the Federal Endangered Species Act for the covered landowners. The HCP is essentially going to translate the new rules and the conservation actions described in the Private Forest Accord report into the HCP document. These will serve as the basis for the conservation actions in the HCP. The HCP will also describe and quantify the anticipated benefits and the impacts of the covered species. And the HCP is being written in a way to meet the regulatory requirements of the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, hereafter collectively referred to as the services. So here's the list of the covered species in our habitat conservation plan. You'll note that they are only aquatic species. Most of them are salmonids. There's also a few other species of fish and 5 species of stream amphibians. So again, the purpose of the HCP is to obtain the incidental take permit. The incidental take permit will apply to the covered aquatic species list that I just showed you. It will cover most forestry activities. The only activities that are specifically excluded are application of pesticides and herbicides. The incidental take permit will legally authorize the incidental take of covered aquatic species. And incidental take means take that occurs during normal forestry activities and is not purposeful. The incidental take permit will apply to the covered landowners. So our habitat conservation plan will be a programmatic HCP. So what does this mean? It means that ODF will have the agreement, hold the agreement with the federal agencies. ODF will hold the incidental take permit. And it's through administration of the revised rules and implementation of the requirements of the HCP that allows us to essentially pass down those regulatory assurances to the regulated community and the covered landowners. So ODF has a contractor on board already, and we're hard at work in developing the habitat conservation plan. We're using ICF to do the work, and you may recognize this name. They're the same contractor that's working on the State Forest Division Habitat Conservation Plan. We also have a steering committee formed and that has already been active to provide input on the habitat conservation plan development. Our steering committee members include representatives of the Private Forest Accord authors, some ODF Forest Resources Division staff, state agencies, primarily Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Environmental Quality, and then the 2 regulatory federal agencies, NIMS and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So the timeline for our HCP is it's basically we're already hard at work at it. We're developing the first draft, and we're coming. Sorry, I'm getting myself all confused by my slide. We're coming to you in November with the first draft of the HCP to seek board approval to move forward and submit this HCP to the services. And this is one of the mandatory deadlines in Senate Bill 1501 is that we must submit a draft habitat conservation plan to the services by the end of this year. So this is one of our first primary deadlines. Next slide. So however, the bulk of the work on the habitat conservation plan is anticipated to happen after January of 2023. So there's significant work yet to be done. We have additional analyses and writing to do, as well as, and we need to develop the public draft HCP. We have many more meetings planned with the steering committee and services to get needed input. And then we also plan to initiate the Environmental Planning Act process, the NEPA process, and to support the services to develop the draft EIS for this. The final deadline noted in Senate Bill 1501 is that we must have an incidental take permit issued prior to the end of 2027. With that, that completes my presentation, and I turn it back to Nick. Thank you.
Thank you for these overviews and to all the staff who worked so hard to get these rules to this point. As the decision before this body is whether to open public comment period and have the department hold a public hearing, here are the next steps to meet the legislative mandated deadline of November 30th, 2022. After the 30-day public comment period, we'll review the comments. The department will review the comments, make needed changes, and submit the comment summary and final recommended rules to the Board of Forestry for consideration at its October meeting. And DOJ is also in the process of reviewing these rules. On November 30th is the deadline for the board to adopt the rules, which means have them fully uploaded into the Secretary of State's site. In the spring of 2023 through the winter of 2024, we'll be doing training and outreach on the new rules with private landowners and staff. July 1st, 2023, the rules go into effect for large landowners for stream buffers only. On January 1, 2024, all the rules go into effect for all landowners. Again, thanks to the ODF staff and the Oregon Departments of Fish and Wildlife and the Oregon Department of Revenue for their efforts and collaboration to bring these rules to this body today. Thank you, Chair Kelly. This is the brief overview and it's a natural break in our presentation. We can either take questions now or after a break. Thank you.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much. I'm impressed with how well organized all of you were with this presentation and how I know also, I think we understand how difficult it is to take all of this work and boil it down to this high level presentation. And so good work. At this point, I think we're a little bit ahead of schedule. I'm thinking if any board members have any questions or comments at this time, we can do that. Then we'll take a short break. And then after that, we'll be back with a process where we have public comment as well as more opportunity for board discussion. So I see Brenda's got her hand up. Brenda, go right ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Question regarding the last topic on the HCP. Jennifer, this is probably a question for you. Since the new riparian rules will go into effect prior to the approval of an HCP, what assurance do we have from the agencies, from the services, that the new rules will meet the requirements of an HCP?
Sure, I'm happy to answer that question. So there's two thoughts come to my mind. One is during the private forest accord negotiations, I know that the group of authors worked closely with the services to obtain feedback from them on the rules and whether they would meet the requirements. We have just started to work with the services directly and have meetings with them. And the read that I'm getting from the early conversations is that there are no red flags. And so we are proceeding as normal and don't see any huge hurdles. And so, you know, there are no assurances, of course, the devil's in the details, but we're moving forward and we'll continue to work through to achieve the success of the.
Thank you, Jennifer. Just a very quick follow-up. So it is possible that there could be a concern raised by the services at some point, which would need to be addressed. Is that correct?
That could happen, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I see a couple more raised hands. So Board Member Joe Justice and then Board Member Carla Chambers.
Okay, thanks, Jim. This is Joe Justice for the record. Two questions. One, maybe for Nick, I'm not sure who wants to answer this. When are you going to start training? You know, these are significant changes to the Forest Practice Act. And we've talked about landowner changes and et cetera, but when are you going to begin training of stewardship foresters? When is that going to begin? How are you going to be doing that? These are big changes, lots of questions. You know, I'm in the industry, so I get a lot of these sorts of questions. So I'm curious as to what the plan is there. And then secondly, the next question, when will the model results come forward related to perennial, streams, et cetera? I mean, this falls into, landowners are trying to, in the case, large landowners will be held to these rules mid-year next year, which means you have to start prepping to be able to execute compliance with the rule by mid-year. When are those models for perennial streams specifically going to be, when will that be out? Those are my two questions.
Thanks, Board Member Justice. Yes, on the training front, thank you for that. We're in the process of hiring a manager to head up the training program, and there are about 6 to 8 training positions across the division to address training both internally and externally. So developing that at the same time, that manager will be responsible for that with the kickoff with some of the training related specifically to that question about the first set of rules going into effect on July 1st, 2023. And that layer needs to be completed by May 1st, 2023 to give ample time for training, exactly to your point, Board Member Justice. So that's where we're at with the training. The other piece that will inform that is the reference made earlier about the forest practices technical guidance to help inform operators and landowners on how these rules can be achieved and give that technical support. So it'll also be a model of reaching out with staff and getting our staff up to speed on the new rules, because you're right, it's over 110 changes to the administrative rules, 110 new rules. So there's a lot there, and very cognizant of that.
My second question was the model with perennial streams. When will that data be out?
The data for the model, I see if can get that date back. There's still some I'm looking around to see if there's someone who can speak to that. The person on point is out today, unfortunately.
Okay.
Working on that, but we can circle back with you on that and get you.
Yeah, I would appreciate that. I mean, there's a lot of questions. There's some very significant changes with perennial stream protections, and both in Western Oregon, Eastern Oregon, and that defining. It's my understanding that model will be predicting perenniality in the and then there's going to be a process by which a landowner could challenge that conclusion or decision, and so that's kind of a big it's kind of a hanging unknown out there that limits the ability of landowners to begin planning and begin doing things on the ground in preparation for these rules. So I'd be very curious as to when the anticipated when we will see that.
We'll make sure to get that date back to you, that information, when we have that.
Okay. I think that'll be very interesting. I'm sure lots of landowners are thinking that very same thing.
So Joe, I can speak to that a little bit, just because ODFW does have a charge of reviewing the model results to ensure sufficient regulatory certainty to inform. And there's two different models, and one of them is already complete. One of them is going to be complete soon in the next few months. But I don't think that I think the timelines in the rule, or that the model review process doesn't have to conclude until, I think it's July 1st, 2024, something by that. So there's an interim process in place now by which landowners would be undertaking essentially operational surveys in the rule to there is not a modeled end right now, right? They'd be looking at operational surveys. So it's a couple of years before the model review process actually happens.
Yeah, so that's going to be a significant loose end for landowners. How do they? And this is going to kind of bear out as we train stewardship foresters. Many places have really good information about fish presence, et cetera. But then this definition of perenniality, where that is, that's going to be that's going to be a loose end that landowners are going to be struggling with. And I appreciate that, Chandra, you're engaged with that process. It'd be important that landowners understand that process, between this interim period between those model results coming out. What are we doing? I mean, there's a drop dead date, coming at large landowners, July 1st, 2023. And which means large landowners have to be preparing units long before July 1st, 2023. Just how it's all this stuff is rapidly approaching. Sneak right up on us, but that's a big one that's hanging out there.
No, I completely agree. And I think the whole process around the protocols, right, that you can utilize, or landowners can utilize in different scenarios to validate the information is very important as well, and making sure everybody's well equipped to be able to undertake those, whether they're small landowners or large landowners. So it's a huge piece. And I think the small landowner office has a big role to play there also. And I'm hoping it's something that the stakeholders are going to be continuing to prioritize in their conversations going forward.
One clarification there, the fish buffers will be July 1st, 2023, and the perennial rules go into effect January 1, 2024 for large landowners. If that helps provide
Oh,
clarification.
okay, that's a little more clarification. That's okay. Appreciate that. Okay.
You're welcome.
Viola.
Okay, thank you. Two requests and one question. There's 7 or 8 really large economic drivers to Oregon Department of Forestry financially right now. And I just want to be sure that we keep these top of mind as board members. So we've been harvesting from 16 to 20, about 2.877 billion board feet a year in Oregon. I want to understand the economic impact and the harvest tax impact of the private forest accord as we target, 10% of private land. So I just want to be sure that, I have those numbers in my mind and an understanding for the board. Secondly, in the 141 pages on the private forest accord, I didn't see a strong evaluation, meaning at the end of, how do we know that this worked? So if we target 10% at this economic cost and set aside, how are we going to evaluate that this has really been effective and it's working? And I want to be sure I understand that going in, not as we muddy the waters, and muddle once we're in the middle of the process. So I'd really like clarity on that. And finally, I've had a third party kind of check my numbers, and right now we're at about 19,471,000 acres in Oregon, or 66% of Oregon's forests are managed for habitat and other non-timber values. So it's roughly 20 million of our 30 million acres are now managed for habitat. And my question is, I think we're on a world basis, that's a remarkably high percentage, and yet we're really struggling on habitat protection. And so I would just want us to challenge ourselves, in a bigger way on why.
Yeah, Carla, I guess I would want to challenge those numbers and what you're getting, whether that's just classifying all federal land as being managed for habitat. I would like to know more before I just have. That's a pretty dramatic statement. So
yeah, I'm going to put that. I'll put that on public record, Jim, so everybody can see those numbers. I ask for a senior forest economist to validate those. So. I want those do need to be on public record. And I think it's just important that we stand back and say, where are we? Where are we in this equation?
Yeah, I understand what you're doing. I just, I think those kind of claims we need to, really understand what's being classified by who and how. And looks like Chandra, you have your hand up.
Thanks, Jim. Well, first, I just want to say thank you to the ODF staff. I think that was a really helpful presentation, and again, a very concise presentation of a really lengthy amount of effort. And I know you guys have put in countless hours on this truncated time frame, so thank you. So I do think one of kind of getting to the how are we tracking progress, Carla, that point, I think one of the big accomplishments of the PFA is the adaptive management program. And I'm very excited to see some more details on that process. And I think it's really important that that process is funded, that it's ultimately transparent. And a really important piece of it, it's guided by goals and objectives that we're hopefully able to track, right? And understand how well they're being met over time and adjust as needed. So a couple of questions related to that. My first is around the decision-making. And I know in recent audits of the Washington Adaptive Management Program, there's been some challenges with meeting deliverables on time. And part of it is around the decision-making, I think, and they have a 100% consensus decision-making framework to identify their agendas and research questions. And I'm curious how we're anticipating it moving forward here with the different committees driving some of those priorities. And I understand there's board engagement as well. And maybe that's part of the charter discussion, but if there's been discussions on that point. The second is how are we anticipating a broader audience being looped into what those groups are doing, both the independent science group and the adaptive management group? Again, one of the suggestions in Washington was that you have this dashboard, right, to kind of let folks track what's being prioritized in those venues and, what their progress is over time and conducting studies and monitoring and all of that. And so I think that's a nice idea. And I was just curious if we'd had some thought about that. And then my third question, and then I will stop, does get to the funding piece. And I'm interested in understanding, when I look at our budget request for PFA, it includes the adaptive management and it includes our small forest landowner request as well. And it's a pretty big request. And both of those points are really important. And so I guess I'm trying to understand if that's the level of requests we're anticipating over time and what that looks like with our other budget priorities. Is it, number one, sufficient to fund what we think we'll need over time? And number two, because it's such a big ask, how is that going to compete with our other priorities in the department going forward? So sorry, that's 3 questions.
Chair Kelly, if you like, I can respond to taking the first 2 is kind of a whole, is the decision-making within the adaptive management committee and the independent research and science team. That's laid out in the rules. And then we have one staff person assigned specifically, the legislature gave us one position specifically to support that work and be the contact there. And on a broader outreach for this specific topic and generally across the private forest accord, there's a lot that happened through that process and a lot that the department has to train folks on and do outreach. And there are a couple of public affairs positions assigned to help us with that. On the third question, the funding, that seems the board will need to sort through that over the years. This initial, there's step is with the policy option package that I believe was approved by the board to go forward for the next biennium to do the initial funding for these programs. And then it'll be from biennium to biennium on how that will happen. And once it's approved as part of the policy option package, it would go forward as part of the base budget, is my understanding.
Chair, could I just do a quick follow-up, I guess, just for future topics? As it relates to the budget, I am interested in understanding what exactly is being funded with the amount we're requesting and how we anticipate, like, for instance, with our small landowner grants, like, what's the magnitude of project that we think we can secure with the amount that we're requesting and what we're thinking about over time. And then 2, I am interested in, I appreciate that we have a position that's going to be dedicated to the adaptive management process, but I'm thinking about the deliverables that those groups are going to be creating in their work plans and just making sure that we have an easy way for a broader audience to access the information from that group. And so that's just a topic for later, I think.
Okay, we've got hands up from Board Member McComb and Board Member Doimling. I'd like to go ahead with those 2, and then probably after that, we'll take a break, and then we'll have more opportunity for board discussion and comments, as well as the public testimony after the break. So, Brenda?
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Brenda McComb for the record. I just want to make a statement, not a question, both in the context of the PFA today, but also in previous discussions regarding state forest HCP deliberations. I've heard the statement, and today from Carla, that habitat is being protected on other lands. I just want to be very clear that everybody needs to recognize that habitat is species specific. Habitat is not something that applies to all animals or all plants. Each species has its own habitat requirements, and that's why HCPs are needed to address each one of those species covered by the HCP. So when we say that there's habitat on other lands, habitat for what species? And what part of that species' geographic range is covered by that land ownership? the devil is definitely in the details. These broad general statements about habitat protection without getting into the details really clouds the issue tremendously. And I just beg my colleagues on the board here to be much more specific when you use the term habitat. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ben?
Yes, thank you. This has been, I'll echo other folks' comments. Thank you to staff very much for this. This has been a great primer and helps me understand all these pages. I guess following up on what does success look like? Do we, if this process is successful, am I correct that one big measure of success is the HCP? It seems to my mind that achieving that document, that plan, is one big step for this whole process to be successful. We have that, we have certainty, and I'm assuming that's probably a 50 or 70 year timeline, a long timeline. HCP is that really one of our probably biggest measures of success for this process and this whole project?
I'll go ahead and address that. This is for the record. This is Jennifer Weichel. I think you're right, Ben, that getting the HCP finalized and having that incidental take permit is going to be a huge milestone of success. And it's one of the key parameters of the private forest accord. And if we're not successful, that is one of the contingencies in Senate Bill 1501. If we're not successful in finalizing the HCP and getting the incidental take permit, everything rolls back to the current situation as far as the rules rolling back. So it's definitely one of the primary milestones for success.
Okay, thank you. I've got one comment, and it regards the compliance monitoring, and I'm really excited by those changes. When I came on the board, both myself and others were pretty disturbed by the fact that this compliance monitoring that we were supposed to endorse clearly was not something that you can trust, because there was no ability by the state to actually come onto landowners' properties who weren't willing to participate. So this is a big change, and I look forward to being able to see information, see data in the future that we can trust. So very pleased about that. With that, we're doing pretty well on schedule, so let's take a break and be back in 11-12 minutes here at 5 after 10. And with that, we're adjourned for a short break. Thank you. Okay, everybody, welcome turning to the virtual meeting room. And at this point, they have completed the presentation. So I wanted to give an opportunity for more board discussion and questions. And if not, we'll if there's anything, we will move towards our public testimony. Ben.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to bring up another topic that was it's been just a little bit in the opening comments, and that is the impact to small forest landowners. And I really appreciate that the Accord authors throughout all of this work have acknowledged that outsized or potential outsized impact. And the work that has been done for the Small Forest Landowner Office and all of the work around small forest landowners is commendable and really important. And I am very happy to see all of that work to have taken place. As has been acknowledged, there's certain folks, certain landowners who will be disproportionately affected. And some landowners up to 70 or more % of their forest land will become encumbered through this. And that needs to be addressed. I think that has not really been fully finalized in these rules yet, and there is a path forward to do that. And I wanted to read just a moment from the public testimony that we got in our email here the last day or two. There's a sentence that I felt like really summed up what this is about. And this is from David and Marianne Bugney, I think you pronounce their name. For some like us, we are willing to bear these costs. For others, this cost may be too great to bear, and we hope these woodland owners do not convert their forest land to other uses to avoid this significantly negative revenue impact. We also hope that the public will come to realize the cost that the PFA will impose on small woodland owners who are affected, as such sacrifices by all of us will ultimately benefit the public in the state of Oregon. And I think they said it better than I could, that these are public benefits that are being provided by private landowners. And I wanted to highlight that. And I am fully in favor of protecting these streams. And I'm very interested in continuing to find ways to support small landowners so that they can continue to own and manage those lands.
Hey, I appreciate what you said, Ben. I am in full agreement. I was impressed with their testimony as well. And I think we need to informally, I hope as a board, be sending a strong message that for those who are affected in that very deep ways that we need to be there for them as we find ways for alternative practices, et cetera. And I see Chandra and I see Joe with their hands up. So go ahead, Chandra.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for that, Ben. I was really struck by that testimony as well, and I thought that was a really eloquent way to put it. So I appreciate you reading that. And actually, it just brought to mind a question that I had to make sure I understand. I know the rule language references this process, right, where we are going to be looking at the significant disproportional impact. And I'm just curious, we're developing a process for it. Is that potentially another rulemaking process or a stakeholder process, or do we have any detail on what exactly you guys are thinking about there?
This is Nick Henneman, and the disproportionate impacts question, there's still the language there. Yes, there's need for further clarification on that. And that's part of what we're looking at, having DOJ involved in this process as well to help give some guidance on that, which you might see further clarification in the final rules coming out of the public comment period.
Okay, great. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Joe.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Joe, just for the record, I really appreciate what you said there, Ben. Your comment was very well. I mean, very pointed and very, it makes, drives some real important aspect of all this, and how these, the costs are not necessarily equitable. They're very different. It's very hard to get at exactly, different landowners and how they're going to be impacted by these rules. But my only other comment, I just need to point out, I just want to remind the board and remind everybody listening, we Oregon forest landowners are already, held to a very robust set of rules, even currently under the existing forest practice regulations that we today are under, and we're making those rules even more robust. And I think that I don't want to make sure that that's not lost. We have significant protections even today on streams and roads and the variety of different aspects that we're regulated. In my entire career, I've worked under these rules and regulations, and they've worked. And I think that I just want to make sure that that's not lost on this. We are increasing those protections. We are, moving from significant protections to even more significant protections for protected species in these very, very important habitats, riparian areas especially, and how road systems and such, and potential sediment loading. So I just want to make that statement that we have significant rules, and that these rules now are just becoming that much more robust. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And any other thoughts and comments from board members at this point? You will have, after public testimony, another opportunity for questions and comments. Okay. All right, so we will go to public comment. Hillary, do we have anyone signed up to provide comments on this item?
Chair Kelly, we have 4 folks signed up for today under item 2.
Great. Okay. Thank you for those who have signed up to provide testimony to the board today. We ask that everyone in the Zoom queue not exceed their allotted time of 3 minutes. I ask that before you start, that you state your full name, the associated affiliation, if you are representing a group or an organization. A timer will be provided to track your time, and each commenter will be called on by the board administrator. With limited time available, anyone who exceeds their time will be prompted to provide a closing statement and then muted. Okay, Hillary, are we ready to go?
Yes, Chair Kelly, we are.
All right.
Everyone in the queue for item 2, thank you so much for joining us today. To ensure we stay on track, I will list your names in a set order and call on each of you to begin your testimony. When you begin, a timer will be displayed for 3 minutes. When you see that timer run out, we just ask that you provide your closing statement. If not, I will prompt you to. So the order will be, first up would be Tiffany Roddy. Second up, Greg Schmitz. Third up, Dan Klopman. Fourth, Bill Thompson. All right, if we can have Tiffany Roddy join us.
Hi, Hillary. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Perfect. Let's get started.
Wonderful. Your time starts now.
Chair Kelly, members of the board, State Forester Mukomoto, thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony this morning. For the record, my name is Tiffany Roddy, and I am Manager of Government Affairs with Roseburg Forest Products. We are a family-owned company that started right here in rural Oregon 86 years ago. Roseburg is a signatory to the Private Forest Accord, or PFA, which, as we all well know, is the historic agreement between a coalition of private forest landowners and environmental organizations to make changes to the Forest Practices Act. On top of continuations to protections of clean water and wildlife habitat, this agreement helps provide legal certainty and regulatory stability for Oregon's forestry sector and the hundreds of thousands of jobs it supports both directly and indirectly. With this PFA agreement, the resulting regulations, habitat conservation plan, and the adaptive management process, these will all assure Oregonians a stable forest products sector that produces a much needed supply of renewable wood products, jobs, and good forest management to reduce wildfire risk. These draft rules before you today are the reflection of countless hours of combined work between all of the PFA signatories, as well as ODF and ODF&W. And these are all this work was done to ensure that the regulations are consistent with the original PFA agreement. With all that said, we're here today alongside our PFA collaborators to ask you to accept these draft rules as presented and move the rulemaking process forward on schedule. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak and for your time today.
Thank you very much. Next up is Mr. Greg Schmitz.
Good morning, Chair Kelly, Forester Makamoto, and members of the board. My name is Greg Schmitz. I'm a contract logger from Silverton, Oregon, and currently the immediate past president of Associated Oregon Loggers. Associated Oregon Loggers serves nearly 1,000 individual small businesses and 23,000 hardworking Oregonians. AOL represents the workforce that is ready to steward our forests every day. Although AOL is not a signatory to the Private Forest Accord, our board chose to accept the outcomes of the negotiations. Our association governance was in no way unanimous in this decision, and many voiced strong opposition to the process and its outcomes. While loggers like myself are concerned about the loss of viable forest lands available for sustainable management, we also recognize the importance of protecting the long-term viability of our industry. It's very likely that loggers and other forest operators will have less work going forward. They will have to pivot their businesses or be forced into early retirement as a result of the changes to the Oregon Forest Practices Act as outlined in the Oregon Revised Statutes and the draft Forest Practices Rules before you today. Regrettably, these are casualties of political negotiation. With that said, AOL was more than happy to help craft and weigh in on the draft Forest Practices Rule package before you. Our goal is to reduce additional harm to the forest operator community and to work to ensure that implementation of the PFA report and associated changes to statute are as reasonable as possible. We've focused our efforts on operational feasibility, worker safety, and understandable protocols, along with reasonable enforcement measures. We hope that you see the quality of this work, the work put into this draft rule package, and the time spent to develop it by all parties, and ask that you move forward with it as proposed. Thank you for your time, and any questions I'm available for.
Thank you very much. Next up is Dan Klopman. And just for your information, Chair and board members, that we will be having the next two via phone. So just a little bit of time while they can join with us. Mr. Klopman, are you ready?
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, go ahead and proceed.
All right, thank you. Hello, I'm Dan Klopman, for the record, second generation tree farmer in Columbia County. I have a 539 acre tree farm with over 2 miles of large fish-bearing stream that runs the entire length of my property. Our income comes from the timber I remove from it. We have the third generation coming up and want to ensure resources for that generation to continue in forestry. I have planted 288,000 seedlings since 1993. I have also converted 70 acres of unproductive land into forest land and completed 3 woody debris in-stream projects. We love our land and the forest, but this will produce a hardship on our family and our ability to maintain my forest as a forest. We live and work on our land and have done so for 39 years. In 1983, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife thought that wood in streams robbed water of oxygen, so they proceeded to run an excavator right down the middle of the Clascanine River, removing all wood out of the stream. In 1993, stream rules were going to be put into place in 1994, which forced us to log where we probably would have never touched. In 1996, salmon were listed as threatened, and as a part of that, habitat restoration proceeded with the knowledge that wood was necessary for the ecological life of fish and other marine life. Biologists put the wood back in the river at taxpayers' expense. That winter, we had a flood, which did the most good for fish, creating gravel bars all up and down our river. In about 1998, a project to put a culvert under the railroad tracks in Clascanine, Oregon, where the river flows into the Columbia River Slough to allow more fish access to the Clascanine River. We have had the most Chinooks, salmon, and coho on our property than any other in the whole entire Clascanine River system since that time, over 20 years ago. I have sent you an aerial photo of our property with a topographical map, along with an article on our stream woody debris project, as well as a photo of my oldest son, which is now 23. The topo map has calculations of 79 acres taken up by the new PFA rules, except no stream width was put into calculations, which is an additional 10 acres for a total of 89 acres lost to RMA. I understand that there is a disproportional income impact agreement not acted on yet. I encourage the Board of Forestry to work out the details for this and make it a high priority to provide relief for small landowners like me who depend on this income that is being taken as a result of these new rules. In 1994, we lost 60 acres to the new stream rules. Retention trees along amounted to 1.5 million board feet of timber. Yes?
Can you conclude your testimony?
Yes. Anyway, we lost $750,000 then, and now we are going to be way over that in loss. So thank you for your time, and open invitation to anybody who wants to come and look down our stream and look at our stream surveys. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Last up is Mr. Bill Thompson. Mr. Thompson, are you ready to proceed? Mr. Thompson, you might need to hit *6. We'll give him just a few seconds.
Okay, I'll begin again if I may. I'm Bill Thompson.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm Bill Thompson, the spokesman for my wife's organization. It's a small organization, and the purpose of that organization arose to the fact that she did quite a few woodlot deals. She's ended up with a couple woodlots that are still in her corporate ownership, one, and the other one in her private ownership. The reason I brought this to your attention is that we naturally have, at our age, I'm pushing towards 80 and my wife's older, we're naturally biased in a couple areas that affect what I'm going to say to you. Our biases deal from the fact that my wife escaped from Vietnam and all their land was taken in Vietnam, and that my being part American Indian a little bit and descended from the tribes that one of the tribes that was put on the Trail of Tears by Andrew Jackson in 1840. And so my wife's Asian direct and my little bit of American Indian in me makes us very biased in whatever we're going to say, because we're very much afraid of government takings. Having said that to you, I want to let you know that I've always liked ODF. They're the best regulatory agency I've met in my other businesses in the last 45, 50 years in America. And so I really appreciate how they've done so well already as a regulatory agency. However, we have a lot of serious questions. You've read my letter to you. The other point I want to make as our second point is that my wife expects some mighty big losses coming from the drying up of creeks. Even dry creeks are being, under the new accord, being extended with 75 or 100-foot buffers on each end, and non-fish bearing creeks. And then the slopes issue is very major for her, because she really doesn't think there should be any more than one slope issue on each 100 acres or something. And she anticipates 40% of her land and her timber will be lost through this accord. Now, having said that to you, we are not legalistic. We're trying to warn you that since I was in a legalistic business for so many years, in a public relations business, that I did get contacted by two big law firms that are breathing down the neck of the accord. And we ourselves are not litigious oriented at our age, so we're not going to have any direct involvement in litigation. However, they told me on these conferences that the accord might not be constitutionally challengeable if the just compensation is large enough to truly equal the appraised value. And cash would be better, but they've said it might even work if there's a tax credit system, as long as it's very big and equitable to cover their loss of land taken out of production and the loss of all their timber on it. The second thing they said,
Mr. Thompson, we're going to have to ask you to provide a closing comment.
Okay. Well, the second thing would be that the timber issue on the slopes is just way too scary. It uses the minimum 50% on a dangerous slope. So my only last comment then, and I thank you for that, is that my final solution is to insist that all the people that we know as members just wait and see what happens, and see if you guys will accommodate the requests in this letter. If you don't, and if it can't be accommodated, then they'll just have to wait and not drink the Kool-Aid. They would not accept, and hopefully recommended, they would not accept the tax credits, and that would be not drinking the Kool-Aid, and just wait for some law firm to call them and then engage them on a contingency basis. Thank you for your time today. I'd like to leave my phone number for the public, 503-415-1638. Thanks again.
Thank you, testimony providers. We appreciate your participation today, and you are welcome to stay in the meeting for the remainder of this item. However, we ask that you remain muted and disengage your video unless called upon by the board. Chair Kelly, members of the board, and State Forester Mukomoto, this concludes public testimony for item 2.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. Board members, any questions or comments at this point after hearing testimony? Okay, not hearing any. As a reminder, the staff has presented us a two-part motion as it provides clear direction to the department specific to the administrative rulemaking process. So the proposed motion is that the board directs the department to publish a notice of hearing and its intent to adopt the proposed rule package as outlined in Senate Bill 1501 and Senate Bill 1502. And the second part of that is that the board directs the department to accept public comment for 30 days after notice is provided, starting September 1st, 2022. So I am looking for a motion and a second to do just that. Joe.
Joe, just for the record, I'm not going to make a motion, but I just want to declare that my company and myself personally will have a potential financial impact related to this vote. I intend to support it, but yet I want to make that declaration. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. And Ben.
Likewise, I just wanted to acknowledge there is a potential conflict here, as I am a timber owner. Like Joe, I intend to support it, but I wanted to put that on the record that there's a potential conflict of interest. Thank you.
Appreciate hearing that from both of you. And so I'll go back to requesting a motion.
Chair Kelly, Liz moves to one, direct a notice to adapt the package. And then secondly, direct public comment for 30 days following that.
Okay. And your motion is essentially as I read and outlined, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And do we have a second?
Second.
Ben Doimling seconds.
Okay. Chandra beat you to it. All right. We have a motion. It's been seconded. So, and any further discussion? Okay. I would like to ask you all to make sure you're unmuted and prepared to vote, and I will call the roll. Okay. Liz Poa,
I vote aye. Yes.
Carla Chambers,
Aye.
Ben Doimling,
Aye.
Chandra Ferrari,
Aye.
Joe Justice,
Aye.
Brenda McComb,
Aye.
and I am an I myself, Jim Kelly. So that we have passed a motion. Again, it's a two-part motion that we've directed the department to publish a notice of hearing and its intent to adopt the proposed rule package as outlined in Senate Bill 1501 and 1502. And the second part, that the board directs the department to accept public comment for 30 days after notice is provided, started September 1st and September 1st of this year. Well done. And again, just really want to express our appreciation to staff. Just a great presentation today. And we're again ahead of schedule. So let's take another break, but let's just make it 5 minutes right now or 6 minutes. Let's return at 10:30. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Hillary Olivos-Rude, the Board of Forestry Administrator. Just letting you know, we are ready to begin with item 3 whenever you are.
Okay, thank you, Hillary. Appreciate that. We are ready to resume. Our next item is the agency budget development, which is a decision item, and we're going to hand it over to Bill. Bill, are you ready to go?
I am ready, Chair Kelly.
Go ahead.
All right, thank you. So good morning, Chair Kelly, State Forester Mukomoto, and members of the board. For the record, I am Bill Herbert, Deputy Director for Administration. I'm here today to report on agenda item number 3, which is a decision item, the 2023-25 agency request budget approval. This is our final stop in the decision-making process the board has been engaged with in the last few months regarding our agency's budget for the 23-25 biennium. As you recall, this started with the board approving the guiding principles for budget development in January, followed by engagement on the policy option packages several times. Before we get started with the ARB, I'd like to just give a high-level background of the state's biennial budget development process to give you some context of where we are and where we'll be headed next. Our state's budget process has 4 major phases: the agency request budget, or ARB, of which we're wrapping up now, the governor's recommended budget, GRB, the legislatively adopted budget, LAB, and finally, the legislatively approved budget, also known as the LAB, which occurs during budget execution. Agencies start the budget process at the beginning of even-numbered years. The ARB lays out the policies and program delivery the agency asks the governor to recommend to the legislature and is prepared under guidelines set by the Department of Administrative Services and through priorities outlined by the governor. Ultimately, it consists of descriptive narratives, budget forms, and audited Oregon Budget Information Tracking System reports, or otherwise known as ORBITS reports. The ARB is primarily built from the department's current service level, CSL, which I'll describe shortly, plus its policy option packages, or the investment asks that we ask for. The governor and the chief financial office of DAS will then review all agency request budgets to compile the governor's recommended budget. This budget reflects the governor's priorities and her policies and includes data on statewide revenue and expenditures for all agencies. After the release of the GRB, each agency will prepare a GRB document to show the changes the governor made to the ARB. Presentation materials for the legislative process are ultimately developed based on this governor's recommended budget. The GRB is presented to legislative committees as it convenes at the start of the next year. The committee recommendations are presented in budget reports for each budget bill, and a successful passing of these bills produce the agency's legislatively adopted budget. The LAB sets out general fund appropriations, lottery fund allocations, other fund and federal fund expenditure limitations, and position authority for every agency. Each agency prepares a legislatively adopted budget document to show the changes the legislature made to the governor's recommended budget. This is the budget we ultimately execute against come July 1st, 2023. As the biennium progresses, the Legislative Emergency Board can make certain changes to the budget between legislative sessions. In addition, special sessions may be called to deal with budget issues. Any such changes to the legislatively adopted budget results in the legislatively approved budget. I bring that up as forestry regularly has significant changes to its adopted budget through the process of managing its unbudgeted emergency fire costs, as I'll describe at the end of this presentation a little more. So as I mentioned, our ARB is basically made up of 2 components, the CSL, current service level, and the requested POPs. Here is a snapshot of our CSL. So fire protection makes up the bulk of our budget with $198 million, or 36% of the budget. Following is state forests at $121 million, or 22%, and then forest resources at $111 million, or about 20% of the total budget. Next, we have agency admin at about $51 million, and then our miscellaneous funds and programs making up the rest. I do want to point out the planning branch down there in the corner, the little gray box, sitting at about 4.7 million, or less than 1% of our budget. As you know, several of our POPs are looking at adding capacity here, and you'll be able to see that shortly. On top of the CSL, we add our policy option packages, or those investments we are looking for to either add service delivery or better provide for those we already perform. I won't go down this list as they have not changed since the last time we've been in front of the board in June. But looking at this next slide, I can talk to the total numbers now, which are final since being entered into the Orbit system. The total POP or investment ask we are asking for this biennium is $106.7 million. Of that, 61% or $64.6 million is general fund, the remaining balance being 35% other funds and about 4% federal funds. Of the other funds, these revenues would come from our various funding streams, such as timber revenues, forest patrol assessments, billing for services, etc. So with those two components, we arrive at our agency request budget of $650 million. Fire protection remains our biggest operational program, staying at about 36% of our budget. However, you'll note that forest resources now becomes the second biggest program, primarily driven by the investments made to support the PFA. Also note that the planning branch moved out from the lower corner based on the significant investments in capacity, driving their budget to 7.5 million or 1.2% of our total budget. So the previous slide does not mean much until you compare it to our current legislatively adopted or approved budgets. Our ARB is a 3% decrease against our legislatively approved budget. However, if you go back to the legislatively adopted budget, it is a 25% increase in total funds. So absent our ARB, this chart really highlights how our budget balloons over the course of the biennium, typically driven by those emergency fire costs. This biennium, our budget was also driven by other legislative actions. For example, when we pulled in the $50 million to address our potential cash solvency issues. And as far as comparing these budgets on positions in FTE, we are looking at adding 63 positions to the department, or about 58 FTE. I do want to point out, you'll notice that the math doesn't work out here in these charts, but that's due to some limited duration positions being phased out this current biennium. So the 63 new positions would make our total workforce at 1,435 employees. I told you when we started, we talk about next steps, and here we are. So pending an approved decision here today, we will submit our ARB to DAS on or before August 31st. Over the course of the next couple of months, our analyst at DAS CFO will work on our budget into what's called an analyst recommended budget, or ANREC. This budget has recommendations for additions or reductions from our ARB based on the priorities they were given. This is usually provided to us around the end of October. Following that, we will have an opportunity to appeal any decisions with the ANREC to the governor's office around the middle of November, and we often are accompanied by the board chair. Finally, we will see the governor's recommended budget at the end of the year. Of course, everyone knows that this cycle will also have a new governor in place, so they will have 30 days to review that GRB and accept or make any changes to that budget. We will provide the board a complete breakdown of the GRB at an appropriate future board meeting. And with that, we seek your recommendation and decision or any questions. Thank you.
Questions? I'll just comment that I don't envy your management of this process, Bill. And I just heard that I may be called upon for showing up in Salem. So thanks for the heads up on that. Other comments and questions?
I have a question, Chair. So, Bill, first I want to thank you. And I want to remind the board, it was a year ago, January, this agency wasn't meeting payroll. We were at crosshairs with the legislature. We were in the Oregonian every 6 weeks for financial mismanagement. And we were really relying on Katie Koba's office to fund our operation. And Bill, I can't thank you for your leadership enough, because you helped us through just really trying times and getting through third-party financial audits. But I also want to challenge us going forward, because we have some very significant policy issues that will have economic ramifications to this agency. And one of my goals is to be sure we never financially fall into the same trap where we most recently were. And I'm going to ask for an economic modeling concept to help us with a framework as we think about, yes, we're looking at this budget and I get this budget. Here's what I don't get. We are still seeing very high inflation, which impacts our operation. We can expect a reduction in revenue with estate lands HCP. We can expect a reduction in revenue with the private forest accord. We're still really challenged with FEMA paying us in a timely way and in a way they have promised. And when we talked last week, they still owe us $85 million. They are significantly dragging on their accounts receivable to us. We still have a lawsuit pending. If we have a short run recession and 2 years back to back, like we've had of 130 million big fire costs, we find ourselves in the exact same trap as we have been, unless we get substantial additional revenue, which we're asking for. I want to be sure you keep these new policy models square in front of this board so we understand the financial impacts and the potential. We see the big picture to all these siloed pieces, from a policy front, because I feel like we're attacking all of these one at a time, but we're not seeing the potential ramification to the agency. And we need a way to model that and to see it, Bill. So I'm going to ask for your help on that.
Thank you, Carla. First, thank you for the kind words on the work we've been doing. There's a giant team behind me on all fronts within the agency moving that along. So I definitely appreciate that, and I will pass those comments along. But you're exactly right. We're not out of the woods yet. I talk often how our cash situation is still just barely being managed. We do look like we'll have some relatively good news coming from FEMA. I'll highlight that in our next financial report that you'll see next week, but that's not the end of it. You are right. This is a more holistic picture, and you make some good points on what is in front of us. This is the budget. Part of this is general fund, certainly, which is revenue. The rest of it is, a significant portion of other fund, which is just limitation. The revenue comes elsewhere. And those are the issues that you're highlighting, Carla. So we can budget the limitation side all we want, but if there's struggles in that revenue stream to pull that in, that does impact the ability of the department to operate. So you can't disconnect that. Some state agencies do have the luxury that their revenue is tied into the budget, and that's all they have to manage. Other agencies like ours that rely on huge other fund revenue streams don't have that luxury. We do have to manage kind of two sides of that situation. So totally agree. I did make note of that. I think it's extremely wise. One of the goals of MGO and that assessment of the department was to look more holistically at things. We were getting very focused on very specific business lines to the detriment of other parts of the organization or the organization as a whole. So that holistic mindset has to be part of absolutely every conversation. Agree wholeheartedly, Carla. Thank you.
There's two pieces of real fragility to our budget. One is how big our fire years are and if they're back to back in the same biennium. And secondly is it takes a full court press politically to get paid by FEMA. Those are two really fragile parts of our model of which we almost have no control. And then you add these other big policy pieces, and I'm just begging my fellow board members to really be patient and track with us on this, because it wouldn't take much to tip us right back into the same position that we found ourselves in, a year ago, January. Thank you.
Not at all. That it's a constant worry of mine. We are always actively managing the situation, and it would, we can never remove ourselves from that, but it would be nice to get away from that kind of thin edge of being able to manage. I do want to leave kind of on a little positive note. We did I just ran the numbers here. It looks like 26 million of that outstanding 86 million from FEMA is being moved into large project notification, which means we should see that money within 2 to 3 months. So that's active movement. So that's the fast track, Carla.
There's something about that makes me shake.
Okay, great. Yes, Carla, you're absolutely right. I totally agree about the fragility of our finances, and until we do get the fix on large fire costs, we will continue to be in that place. So did I see a hand up from the state forester, Cal?
No, you just said what I was going to say, Chair Kelly, is that we are very fortunate this year, and Bill will attest to this, that our cash flow, that we've been able to manage the cash flow, and largely because of the fire season we've had, and then also help from the legislature with the 50 million, which we haven't had to draw down on yet, right, Bill? But then also in previous years, high timber revenue years, and I don't think there's any guarantee that's going to go forward at the level it did. So thank you, Carla. We need to keep our eyes on that. Modeling some of this is not that easy, and there's big assumptions to be made, and and that's the difficulty. But anyway, thank you, Chair. I appreciate that.
Okay, thank you. Any other board member questions and comments? Okay, not hearing any. Hillary, do we have anyone signed up to provide public comment on this item?
Chair Kelly, board members and State Forester Mukomoto, no one has signed up to provide testimony under agenda item 3.
Okay, thank you. In that case, we're ready to move ahead with a decision, and it would any board member like to propose a motion?
Yeah.
Carla.
I would propose that we adopt the recommendation presented by Bill Harbour this morning with our with this budget request recommendation.
This is Joe Justice. I will second that.
And the wording that was proposed would be to that the board approve the 2023 to 2025 agency request budget and direct the department to submit the required documents to the Department of Administrative Services by the August 31st, 2022 deadline. Does that seem like what, is that what you're proposing, Carla? And
that's what I'm proposing. That was perfectly worded, Jim. Thank
you betcha. You betcha. Okay. And Joe, is that what you're seconding?
Yeah, yes, absolutely, Jim. I will second that. Yeah.
Okay. In that case, we can move right along, and we will take a vote here. And so prepare yourselves for that. Liz Agpawa.
I vote aye.
Carla Chambers.
Aye.
Ken Doimling.
Aye.
Shonda Ferrari.
Aye.
Joe Justice.
Aye.
Brenda McComb.
Aye.
Okay, and myself, Jim Kelly, am an aye as well. So the motion carries with consensus. Again, that is for the board to approve the 2023 to 2025 agency request budget and direct the department to submit the required documents to the Department of Administrative Service by the August 31st, 2022 deadline. Okay, that is really it with our business. And once again, I think I would like to thank the folks from the Forest Resources Division. I know that Josh couldn't be with us, so but Josh deserves a thank you, as well as Nick and all of the other staff members who presented today. And Bill, thank you. we're able, I think, to close this meeting pretty early. And don't think I have any other closing comments. Cal, if you do, or if any board members do, and not hearing any. Oh, Cal, are you there?
Yeah, I thought I would give, my name's Cal Mukamoto again, Oregon State Forester, thanks. Yeah, I really want to appreciate you taking the time today and listening for these on these two important topics, and appreciate your confidence in passing both of them. I did want to talk get a brief update on fire season. At this point, we're experiencing about 2/3 of the number of fire starts compared to our 10-year average, while only seeing 1% of acres burned this year compared to our 10-year average. We still have a lot of fire season left to go, but our success date is due to early detection and initial attack from our firefighters. Our severity, air resources, and early night detection for multi-mission MMA have helped us stop most fires quickly while they're small. And I think that that's largely regarding to the commitment of our firefighters and the support from the legislature through SB 762. With regards to SB 762, I also wanted to mention changes that have occurred to our wildfire risk map. Since the last board meeting, notifications were mailed to property owners in both high and extreme risk classifications. Over the following few weeks, ODF received many comments and appeals of risk designation. Due to the mounting concerns from public and local officials, I decided to withdraw the current version of the risk match, which ended the current appeals process. We are working with OSU on a revised map. We will spend time in local communities to help Oregonians understand the purpose of the map, the statewide data, and the science behind it, and how the map fits into 762's broad approach for reduction of landscapes, scale risk, and increase community survivability. I'll keep you informed on our next steps as they become clear. Lastly, I want to recognize the true commitment from all of you, Board of Forestry, for a busy schedule over the last couple of months that continues through the end of the year to respect your time. And now I will turn it back to Chair Kelly because I'm taking up your time right now, but I appreciate it.
All right, we appreciate you as well as everybody in the department. And not hearing any other comments, I will adjourn this virtual special meeting. Thank you all.
Take care.